No, dobře. Dúfam, že fungujeme. Dajte mi vedieť, že či hlas funguje. Nenašiel som originál link na FOMC, čiže budeme to pozerať cez Yahoo. Tu nám mám nastavené CNBC, čiže hej, budeme to musieť vyriešiť takto, hej. Čiže nie zatiaľ teda oficiálny link. Neviem ho nájsť, neviem, že čo sa deje. Hľadám ho kadejakou formou a za svet mi ho nevie nájsť. Ako náhle prídem na FOMC, tak proste ma to odkazuje na ich ten vlastný kanál, čo je celé zle. Ale mám akože pripravený link aj na originál cez ich stránku. Len viem, že minule, keď sme to pozerali, tak to bolo celé zle, lebo to sekalo ako blázon. Dobre, čiže všetko je OK, to je veľmi, veľmi super, čiže poďme sa pozrieť najprv na market, lebo market celkovo začína krásne pumpovať. Ja som dnes robil Patreon stream a neviem kvôli čomu som ja nevyužil túto danú príležitosť. Hej, kedy som upozrel na nejaké levely, čiže prakticky ja tým, že som už musím sa zbaviť toho, že prestanem, že nebudem longovať, musím konečne si vtrepať do hlavy, že sa to oplatí, aspoň teda v takéto pozitívne správy, keďže Bitcoin zatiaľ teda od nášho livestreamu spravil zhruba nejaké 2,3% zjedol by. No, dobre, čiže zatiaľ teda Bitcoin sa nám drží 3,4% za posledných 24 hodín, market cap takisto narastá, necelé 2%. Bitcoin dominancia 38,1%, to tu už dlho nebolo. Toncoin, Solana takisto, Axie Infinity dnes odstrelil, ale už je vo vyklesávaní. Tron najväčšími víťazmi dneška a čo sa týka najväčších lúzrov dneška, tak tu je Stack, Monero. A čo mi to tu laguje? To mi nesranduj ani. Sekundičku. Kvôli čomu to nejde? No. Dobre. Takže asi toľko a už mám chart pripravený, hej, čiže tu nám máme S&P 500 market, tu nám máme Bitcoin, čiže uvidíme, že kde by sa to mohlo pohnať. Vypnem to na chvíľku. Dobre, ja to na chvíľku vypnem a poďme sa pozrieť tak rýchlo na market, keďže máme ešte keďže máme ešte zo pár minút na analýzu. Dobre, čiže zatiaľ teda pred marketom upozorňoval som na to, hej, na tie hodnoty 18 200 až 18 800 $. Uvidíme, čo on vlastne povie, keďže schôdza začne, alebo teda jeho preskonferencia začne 47 minút, čiže najprv tie targety fakt, že vidím na tých 18 800 až tá hodnota 19 000, ten week môže byť úplne šialený. Dôležité dneska bude, alebo teda dnes ani nebude tak veľmi dôležitý deň, alebo teda konkrétne terajší čas, hej. Čiže skôr si myslím, že zajtra to otváranie a marketu S&P 500 marketu, tak to bude dôležitejšie, keď sa ukľudní ten šialený pohyb. Jeho príhovor je 20-30. Áno. Ale na CNBCčku, áno, tak vychádza to, hej, 46 minút, čiže máme tu, oni začnú trošička skôr, čiže 20-30 bude príhovor o nejakú chvíľku by sme mali mať už aj nejaké dáta. Dobre, čiže kam sa to až môže pohnúť, neviem, akože s každým levelom by som počítal, 19 000 je najviac teraz supportov, následne ďalšia hodnota je až 20 700, čo sa týka 21 a 30 na EMA-ku, to je 20 100 až 20 680. Na Twitteri už viaceré púly hovoria o tom, že pump už skončil a to písali už pri 18 000, alebo teda pri 17 800. Netreba podceňovať túto danú situáciu, netreba byť proste zadubený, tak ako som ja zadubený pri trade. Zase, čo sa týka price akcie, tam som bol pozitívnejší už ráno. Neviem, že kvôli čomu mám ešte taký... Áno, ale tak nebudem vykrádať československý kanál. Keď chcete, choďte na XTBčko, v pohode, oni majú vynikajúci kanál, ale nejdem to tam, ja teraz tu na si ich, hej, na tomto kanále. Bolo by to dosť brutálne divné. To už radšej choďte, keď chcete počúvať čisto neviem, či robia preklad, ale keď to chcete počúvať, tak choďte radšej tam. Nebudem ja sa logovať na ich kanál, hej. To radšej im dajte tie vzdialenia, ako keby ste mali na mojom kanáli pozerať XTB, nedáva to logiku. A už nie vôbec českú scénu, hej, čiže... bude 50 bazických bodov a nepovie zase dohromady nič, najprv pumpa a pôjdeme potom na 17600. On nepovie nič, hej, on prakticky, hej, čo sa týka meetingu, tak dôležité sú, čo nemám zapnutú tú stránku, no mňa porazí dneska, však som ju tu mal. FOMC Watch. Tých 50 bazických bodov je už prakticky ako keby zakorenených. Dosť brutálne prekvapenie by bolo, keby neoznámil 50 bazických bodov, ale by padlo 75 bazických bodov, čiže to by bolo obrovské prekvapenie. A hej, 80% proste už je to na tých 50 bazických bodov. Čiže toto je, mám taký pocit, že zakorenená vec. Čo je dôležitejšie je, čo on tam vlastne povie. Hej, čiže aký narratív bude mať, lebo ja som to aj rozprával, neviem, či pre patronov alebo pre všetkých. Proste on, pochybujem, že prekvapí market, ale podľa mňa to bude v niečo v takom žargone, že CPI-ka sme dostali celkovo dobre, labor market je stále veľmi silný, čiže tam problémy určite nebudú vidieť a preto ostaneme aj napriek tomu, hej, že tu máme brutálne pozitívne veci. Inflácia je stále veľmi vysoko na naše očakávania, čiže preto musíme aj naďalej postupovať so zvyšovaním úrokových sadzieb. Čiže toto bude povedané, mám taký pocit, že v takej tej skratke. A otázne je potom už iba, že akú víziu nastaví na rok 2023, hej. Čiže tam to bude celkovo dôležité, možno bude aj rozprávať, alebo teda mali by sa ho pýtať na ten rok 2023 a uvidíme, že aké hodnoty on nastaví, hej. Čiže on bude určite rozprávať o nejakých tých úrokových sadzbách do konca roku 2023 a to bude veľmi dôležité. Marian, tak on to nepovie, ale toto je ich taká tá najideálnejšia vec, čo by chceli spraviť, hej. A to je presne, čo píše Marian, že chce, aby trhy padli a že ekonomiku musí zlomiť. Lebo keď zlomí ekonomiku, tá inflácia by išla oveľa rýchlejšie smerom dole. Tie vaše komenty, pumpuje to kvôli tomu, aby to malo kde padnúť. Tak aj to môže byť pravda, ale pochybujem. Dobre, čiže zatiaľ teda sme na 12-hodinovke bullish, na 4-hodinovke bullish, na 2-hodinovke bullish, 45 minútovke, ináč na 45 minútovke stále platí ten level 21 a 30. Podľa mňa to budú teraz krásne sešupy, alebo teda malo by to byť minimálne trošička viac volatilnejšie a ja si tu nastavím, lebo nechcem mať Bitcoin hore, takže si to trošička prestavím a to je takto, tu chcem mať S&P 500 market, dáme si 5-minútový graf, aby sme to sledovali, lebo za chvíľku prídu výsledky meetingu, neviem čo, ja som si to všetko popresúval tu na... Dobre, nič, nastavím si to ešte raz a poďme takto. Tu nastavíme si to takto, nie tak, ale takto. A tu na ten spodok si dáme Bitcoin. Čiže prekvapenie tam, uvidíme, možno teda prekvapí market, lebo to z nich nikto nikdy nevyjde. Dobre, čiže toto tu je... A zase to vidím tak, no normálne má štve ten symbol. V kúse ho dám odstraniť a v kúse mi to nejako nezaregistruje. Dobře, čiže dáme si to takto, aby sme videli los pumpos, alebo los dampos. Toto je 45 minútovka, dáme si 5 minútovku. Nech vidíme akciu. Reakciu marketu. No, toto si takisto dáme tu na... Uvidíme. No čo, prekvapí market, alebo neprekvapí? Powell. Dobre, tak to je v pohodičke. OK, čiže... Kde som? Tu som. Dobre, čiže toto vidno v poriadku a teraz ideme na Fed. No a tu by mali prísť dáta. Ešte som chcel ekonomický kalendár. Dobre, keďže aj tu uvidíme dáta. Ináč dnes má byť Zajtra bude aj Európa, mám taký pocit. Áno, zajtra bude ECBčka a úrokové sadzby. Tam to vyzerá na veľmi zlú vec. Mám taký pocit, že budú navyšovať extrémnejšie. Keďže v Európe to zatiaľ nevyzerá na nejakú cukríkovú vec, čo sa týka inflácie, keďže inflácia rastie v Európe a nedarí sa to nejako príliš veľmi zastavovať. Áno, áno, tak Európa začala, keď si to tak vezmete, hej, Amerika začala, alebo teda Fed začal pred polorokom riešiť úrokové sadzby a Európa ešte len teraz začala. Weekly dominancie na Bitcoine V-pattern. Vieš čo, že ja tú dominanciu ani nesledujem. Myslím si, že to nemá zmysel, hej, podľa mňa. Lebo zase musíme byť taký trošičku realistickejší, aj práve ľudia z tohto, maxíci. Proste, hej, nie každý tu príde kvôli Bitcoinu. Proste taká je realita, hej. Ja by som, minenky, a ja si zavadziam, nie? Tak toto musí byť. Nie, nezavadziam, ale dobře. Čiže toto je Bitcoin do frasa. Dobře. Jak to teraz zmením? To ani nezmením. Do frasa. Alebo dobre, zmením to. Zmením to takto. Čiže... Kde mám tú kameru? No, bum. Idem tu na. Bum. Akože mal som to mať vyriešené už predtým, ale čo sa dá robiť? Dobre, čiže ideme naspäť na kalendár a už by to malo byť všetko v pohodičke. No, či dáme to na 45 minútovku, aby sme videli hodnoty rezistencie a supportu? Zatiaľ nie, zatiaľ je zima, ale zatiaľ sneh nepadá. Tak áno, zatiaľ je to tak. Zatiaľ EU nie je príliš veľmi podstatná. Je to prívesok Ameriky. Zatiaľ áno. 15 minútovku only? 15 minútovka only, čiže 15. No a tu na 15 minútovke aj vidno, hej, že kudy kam. Dáme si automatiku. Ježišmaria, tak toto ma tu štve. Nechcem ten US symbol tam. Kde to je? Bože, tu nás sa s tým teraz srať. Date, hej. No dobre, kašlem ťa. Tak budeš tam. Dobre. Pokud bude 0,5%, tak môžeme zabudnúť na super nákupky. To, že príde jeden dobrý meeting, neznamená, že proste už sme vyšli a ideme to the moon. Hej, čiže bacha na to. Je to veľmi pozitívne, hej, že budeme mať trošička možno lepší čas, ale netreba sa splašiť. No, dobre, čiže rates. O 5 minút. O 5 minút by to malo byť. Áno, presne. Akože oni nebudú robiť bull trap, ale teraz je to také, hej, že fakt, že teraz tie výsledky, čo prišli ohľadom inflácie, vyzerá to tak, že americká inflácia by mala ísť teoreticky smerom dole. Neočakávajú sa tam nejaké, hej, že zrazu to vyletí smerom hore. Myslím si, že nie z toho najhoršieho sú už vonku, ale myslím si, že v terajšej dobe na niekoľko mesiacov by to malo vyklesávať, postupne pomaličky vyklesávať. To si myslia celkovo aj oni. Čiže tie opatrenia, ktoré zabrali, alebo teda ktoré nastavili, tak asi vyzerá to tak, že zabrali. Hej, že tá ekonomika sa nedostala ešte do nejakých extrémnych problémov. Zase, hej, tam môže prísť aj, hej, zlomenie marketu, čiže inflácia môže byť aj naďalej padať, ale proste keď začne padať labor market, alebo teda trh práce a americká ekonomika, tak proste to bude tak, ako to bolo predtým v krízach, že mohli ste nástrať na to, aby si vôbec pozerali na infláciu, keďže ten market sa proste rútil do šialených mínusov. Hej. Čiže to, že inflácia bude vyklesávať, to neznamená, že už proste môžeme zabudnúť, alebo že teda market is going to the moon, hej, lebo stačí, aby sa zlomil labor market. Čiže teraz Fed má takú tú ťažkú tak jak 3, 2, 1, 0,25%. Pochybujem. Dokonca mne ešte aj ten trade drží, ten DAR, čo som vám spomínal. Akože nikde sa nepohol. To je dobré, lebo Bitcoin pumpuje ako blázon a on sa zatiaľ nepohol. Čiže ak by prišiel nejaký dump, tak dúfam, že mi to zoberie take profity. Ale aby SPY strelilo o 1,2%, tomu sa mi nechce veriť. Tak tomu sa nechce veriť ani mne. Zatiaľ, ako si môžete všimnúť, hej, S&P 500 market, dosť brutálna stagnácia. A on stagnuje práve na tej weekly rezistencii. Čiže cookie. Tak len sa snaž. Držím ti palce. Držím ti palce, nech to spravíš do frása. Dobre, čiže prichádza nám zaujímavá chvíľka. Dobre, všetko vidno tak, ako má byť vidno, áno. Hoffman, no zdravíme ťa. Uf. Co to? Uf. a pumpa smerom hore, ale nereaguje vôbec S&P 500 market. Vidno, že to rally bolo vyťahnuté len skrz špekulácie. Čistá špekulácia. A teraz príde zlomenie minútku predtým, než prídu dáta. Ako náhle prídu dáta, tak príde potom nejaký push. A ja tu nemám svoj telefón, kde mám burzu otvorenú. Do frása. Stíham to? Stíham to. Sekundu. Takže som späť. Dobre, poď, Bajbitko. Uf. Toto som presne očakával, hej. Akože, nie čo sa Bitcoinu týka, ale čo sa toho tradu týka. Krasota. No, čiže teraz je psychopatia. No, už by mali byť výsledky pomaličky. Nereaguje zatiaľ. S&P 500 market takisto dump. Uf. Čísla sa nám rozbiehajú. No, a je to tu. Čakať, koľko bolo predtým? Nie. Čiže teraz je... Pane Bože. Dávaj, hej. $50 bazických bodov. Čiže mali ísť na... Áno, 50. Čiže o 50 bazických bodov stúplo. Alebo teda zvýšili decide funding, federal funding rates. Áno, čiže tu je to 50 bazických bodov. Committee seek maximum employment, seek to achieve maximum employment and inflation rates of 2% for over the long run. Čiže klasika, hej, toto, čo som hovoril. Čiže inflácia je príliš veľmi vysoko. Komisia, alebo teda committee, čiže Federal Open Market Committee, chce dokázať maximálnu zamestnanosť a takisto aj inflačný úrok na hodnote 2% z dlhodobého hľadiska. The committee will take into account the cumulative tightness. The committee will take... Čiže, ako to bolo? Čo to bolo? Neskoro na nákupky? Alebo že už nikdy nenakúpime nižšie? Ono príde aj pumpa. Čiže committee is strongly committed to the 2% of objective. Čiže sú silne motivovaní na to, aby navrátili infláciu na 2%. Každý prodáva. Sklamal me Palko, nemá gule. Nie, to je proste, hej, market stúpal ako blázon, a hlavne teda Bitcoin. Proste oni, špekulácia na tom, že neviem, čo sa stane na meetingu, hej. Dnes som to spomínal, včera som to spomínal, že proste toto, alebo proste, mám taký pocit, že buď som to včera spomínal na live, či predvčerom na live streame, alebo dneska na live streame, že toto proste oni povedia, že inflácia je príliš veľmi vysoko, hej, aj keď proste to dali na 50 bazických bodov, inflácia je stále v prdeli, proste musíme proti nej bojovať. Lebo veľa ľudí si myslí, alebo teraz si možno myslelo, že aha, OK, čiže dajú na 50 bazických bodov a to the moon a nakoniec to vypnú. Nedostaneme sa, to vám garantujem, alebo teda nemôžem to garantovať, ale na 90% som si istý, že v roku 2023 budú aj naďalej celý rok navyšovať úrokové sadzby. Či o 25 bazických bodov, alebo o 50 bazických bodov, neviem, ale budú navyšovať aj naďalej. A vyzerá to tak, že celý rok 2023. Čiže hlavne ten repo market repurchases budú dávať dole. Čiže budú stiahovať prachy zatiaľ zo systému, čiže práve preto zažíva šok práve S&P 500 market, lebo ako náhle začnú vyťahovať tie dané prachy zo systému a vyťahovať likviditu, tak to bude znamenať nie príliš najlepšiu správu pre Wall Street. Čiže oni prakticky nespravili nič, len navýšili úrokové sadzby len v úvodzovkách o 50 bázických bodov. A budú znižovať tie svoje treasuries. Od 15, alebo teda konkrétne od zajtra budú úrokové sadzby na 4,5%. Medzi 4,2, 4,25 a 4,5. Ale oni rozprávajú o 4,5. Čiže medzi 4,2 a 4,5 alebo 4,5. Ale to by mal byť strop. No, dobre. Čiže o 50 bazických bodov a prakticky budú vyťahovačky zo svojich rezerv. Čiže tu nás sa nič nemení. No. Takže sme sa dozvedeli to, že Bitcoin is not going to the moon today. Čiže asi toľko statement projection. Tu sú ich projekcie na rok 2023. Čiže... Aha. Ale to máme na... Nie na celý rok 2023. A nie, to je len projekcia. Aha. Čiže pre rok 2000... Škaredé. Čiže tu nám máme projekciu na midpoint target. Dúfam, že to vidno. To neviem to ani približiť. Kvôli tomu možno padá práve market. Čiže pre rok 2023 majú nastavený práve tú svoju projekciu na midpoint of target range alebo target level for federal fund rates. Čiže tie federal funding rates, čiže to sú tie úrokové sadzby, sú práve teraz na tej hodnote 4,5%, ako si môžete všimnúť, hej, celý rok to predikovali a prakticky sedia si na tých bodoch. Projekcia na rok 2023 je 475 bázických bodov, 475 bázických bodov až 5,7 bázických bodov. Čiže navýšenie. Hej, čiže to je presne to, čo som teraz hovoril, hej, že proste oni budú navyšovať celý rok. Otázne je, že ktorým tempom a že či dosiahnu, lebo v tomto roku, toto môže spôsobovať stres, že v tomto roku mali ohlásené, že chcú prakticky dojsť do toho bodu, kedy by mali ten median zhruba na tých 3,75 bazických bodov alebo teda 375 bazických bodov a 400 bazických bodov. A sú na 450 bazických bodoch. Čiže sú oveľa vyššie, ako očakávali. Čiže práve preto je to možno taká zlá správa. Ale market is going to the doom. Hej, chart. Úplne v jednoduchosti je krása. Pozrieme sa potom na weekly, predtým než začne konferencia. Viem, že niekoho naseriem na Patreone, ale ja som to říkal. Proste máme tam na weekly rezistenciu, pokiaľ nebude prejazená na S&P 500 markete a pokiaľ Bitcoin sa nezačne nejako zázračne šplhať hore, tak proste nemáme čo riešiť. Inflácia je malá. Pani, to Fed vždy žíkal kokrhaním. Vždy židí kokrhaním. Vojta, nerozumiem, ale OK. Mají nové low. Ale ináč Tesla predstavila nový update, firmware. Čiže tí, čo máte Teslu, budete si môcť zahrať nejakú hru na Steame. Long run, čo je to? Distributor projection for the GDP. Nič, dobre, to GDP nebude dobre na ďalší rok. Unemployment rates takisto nebude príliš veľmi najúžasnejší. Tam sa očakáva zlom. Čiže tu je posun na tých číslach. Toto vybodkované je predtým. Long run. OK. OK, bratu. PCE core inflation, čiže teraz sú na týchto daných 2022, na týchto daných hodnotách a PCE, na 6,1 sú 6,1, áno. Očakávania mali oveľa nižšie. Projekcia na rok 2023 má byť brutálne pádová a nakoniec ten long run, 2%. OK, čiže long run majú neviem dokedy, ale počítajú teda, že do 2025 sa tam dostanú, tí vole. Tak to veľa ľudí určite nepotešilo. Core PC. Takisto 2025. Neistota ohľadom GDP rastu. Haj. Veľká neistota, super, paráda. Risk to GDP growth. Weighted to downside. Čiže toto nám naznačuje proste že aj oni celkovo očakávajú spomalenie HDPčka. No. Alebo rastu HDPčka. Risk to PC inflation stále je tu veľká. Toto je tu fakt, že odstrašujúce. Hej, unemployment rate. Proste, že akože tá krivka sa ešte nezlomila, ale fakt, že sú tu už nejaké tie trhlinky a oni to musia proste vidieť, že sú nejaké tie trhlinky. PCE a core PCE flatline. Ale to bude month over month. No dobre, čiže tu nám majú projekcie. Do projekcie sa potom ja viac zakúsnem. No, síce sme na konci. Čiže proslov zase up, pak se uvidí. Áno, proslov up a potom a zase dole podľa mňa. A nie, uvidíme. To, co nelze je graf. To, co nelže je graf. Presne. OK, čiže pokiaľ zaujme stanovisko UJO o nejakých 15 minút, tak tu nám chcem len ukázať, tak to ukážem jednoducho, krásne, hej, tu na všetko vidno na weekly. Dobre, čiže to je presne to, čo som predtým poukazoval, hej, na tú vec. Stále je to rezistencia. Ak sa máme dostať na nejaké dobré hodnoty, musí minimálne S&P 500 prekonať práve tieto dané línie. 4074 bodov a zatváranie nad touto danou líniou. Zase, to, že začíname teraz, alebo to, že sme teraz v odmietaní, nie je žiadna katastrofa, hej, lebo ten market je proste prešpekulovaný do špiku kostí, príde Ujo Pavel, môže to odpáliť na, nie že na moon, ale beyond moon. Čiže bacha, hej, teraz upozorňoval som na tú volatilitu, proste ešte deň nie je uzatvorený, čiže to, že vyklesáva, nie je určite dobre, čo sa týka chartu, ale zase, hej, ešte nemôžeme povedať, alebo teda ešte nepovedal posledné slovo, mám taký pocit. Dobre, čiže zatiaľ OK, od včera prakticky, keď prišli pozitívne dáta ohľadom CPI-ka, market proste nejako vyklesáva ten daný market, lebo toto je čistý, hej, high, low, high, nižší než ten predchádzajúci a low. Vyzerá to tak, že bude nižší než ten predchádzajúci, okamžite na to reaguje náš super pán, ktorý takisto proste ide do kytek. No. Ale vidno tú reakciu. Som bol fakt, že bolo to veľmi prekvapivé, že Bitcoin zareagoval oveľa skôr ako S&P 500 market. Čiže predsa len tie moje shorty sú na dobrých pozíciách. The graph on the walls tells the story of the all. Presne. Of it all, pardon. Ktorý z vás je najbohatší? Pavel. A nie, pardon, táto. Jak sa volá? Čaja. Pelosiova. Pôjdeme dole jak zlomničaku na sánkach, presne. Čiže v skratke, hej, taká tá klasika, čo sa týka marketu, hej. Včera pozitívne... Kamarát mi včera rozprával, alebo teda nie mne nadával, ale dával takú, nadával na Discorde, hej, že prídu pozitívne dáta, ten S&P 500 trepe smerom dole. Čiže teraz prišli očakávané správy a zatiaľ sme zažili teda vyklesanie. Uvidíme. Ostáva nám 11 minút, no čo, pumpnú to hore na tie isté hodnoty a následne, keď príde Powell, tak to dumpnú smerom dole. Zajtra začína Avatar. Fakt zajtra začína Avatar? Nie, nešortujem Bitcoin. Shortujem DAR token a ešte zo pár vecí. Ale rozprával som to na Patronom livestreame. Hej, čiže tam som upozorňoval na nejaké hodnoty, alebo teda celkovo na trady. Sice prebehli sme to veľmi rýchlo, ale hej, Lido a takisto ešte aj DYDX. No, ináč som už aj na TikToku. Už niečo žíkal? Nie, až o 11 minút začne. Palko ide kdy o 11 minút. Pali príde a povie no. A všetci pôjdete do toho niekde. Ale rozmýšľam, že kvôli čomu mi nejde tá ich preskonferencia. Kde som to mal? Preskonferencia bola tu. A keď kliknem na, už by mal byť vytvorený ten link. Keď kliknem tu na, oni okamžite... Aha, už je. Super, čiže... OK, toto, oni to majú takú debilnú zvučku, OK. Čiže tu nás si to pozrieme live a nemusíme teda pozerať na Yahoo. Čiže, jak to spravím teraz? Takto. Hop si tuto. No jasné, že to tak nespravím. Jaj. A spravím to takto. Hopsík. Bum. Aha, tu musíme ísť na graf, čiže ideme na graf, tu napôjdeme takto, bim, bác, nech sa páči. Bum, bum, bum. Dobre. Čiže Pali pôjde zhruba o nejakých 9 minút a ja som akurát na... A ja tu nechcem byť teraz, čiže potrebujem ísť na Paliho. Potrebujem ísť na Paliho, nie na CNBC. Čiže, jak to tu vrátim? Každý dáva vysmiatý ksicht Pavela, že proste to položí každý v smútku. To je sranda. Jak to majú napísané? No. Dobře, čiže tu nás sme live. Čiže o chvíľku... No čo? Dámte to ešte nižšie? Oni mali najprv prísť s postom, hej. Na to by si Sizi už mal zvyknúť, že proste treba dať najprv nejaký post a oznámenie a následne proste a následne proste mal upozorňovať na to, že hej, niečo sa deje. Čiže nechápem, že kvôli čomu to spravilo takto Binance. Lebo veľa ľudí si nepamätá ani, čo bolo včera. Takisto aj ja. Čiže uvidíme live S&P 500 market a takisto aj... Predpokladám, že oni budú ísť narovnako smerom dole. Alebo teda dole alebo hore. Ale S&P 500 market zatiaľ, no, nedrží sa príliš úplne najšťastnejšie. A hlavne teda Bitcoin sa nedrží najšťastnejšie. Pochybujem, že to spraví. Nie, práve, že toto ľudí možno zarazilo. Chat is disabled for this live stream. Viem si predstaviť, že kvôli čomu. Viem si predstaviť, kvôli čomu vypínajú ten chat. Pasta na bíky 21.00. 20 000. By the way, dnes som ti vo videu popsal aj to funguje, jak to funguje s téma. Dobre, pozriem to. Ináč, viacerí tam písali, že Mazarsk, čo to za nejaká vytvorená auditná skupina. Oni sú, mám taký pocit, že je POVCčko, potom je Ernst & Young, potom je ešte nejaká veľká auditná spoločnosť. Oni patria, mám taký pocit, že čo sa týka auditov, minimálne do top 10 a mám taký pocit, že možno aj do top 5. Dokonca ich máme aj na Slovensku. Francie, Maroko 1-0. Jen pro info. Kto dal gola? No, Hej, podľa mňa Argentína, Francúzsko a následne Francúzsko, uvidíme, ale predpokladám, že Francúzi by mohli vyhrať. Majú celkovo dobrý tým, aj keď Argentína sa teraz rozbehala na posledný zápas, hej, chudáci Chorváti. Bolo zdvihnutie áno, o pol bazického boda. Čiže zdvihli to o pol bazického boda a následne proste market sa vystral z toho. 5 minút. Očakávaná vec. To the moon. Na Yahoo si môžeme prečítať komenty. Daddy Powell. Bulls waiting. Ináč to môže byť pravda. Zatiaľ to ešte nenaplo. It's 50-50. Just say something nice, Powell. It is Christmas season. No určite, áno. Spraví jedine, že by ste boli v šorte a tak to vám spraví možno. Dobrý deň. No a celkový pohľad na ten Binance, co si myslíš, je to FAT? Dúfam, že je. Vyzerá to zatiaľ teda ako FAT, hej. Hlavne v prvom rade nastali tam obrovské výbery a Binance je v poriadku. Hej. Čiže a celkovo, čo sa týka FTX, pri FTX s tými informáciami prišiel Twitter, hej. Čiže ono to nebolo také, že na FTX proste bolo spúšťané x kvantum článkov. Práve naopak, na FTX proste nebolo príliš veľa článkov a len ľudia to rozoberali a rozobrali práve na Twitteri, čo sa všetko udialo a potom kryptomédia, hej. Lenže čo sa týka tých Binance správ, ktoré prišli, tak to bolo proste, hej, Wall Street Journal, Reuters, hej, proste všetky články, ktoré sa bežne nemenujú médiám, zrazu na zhruba tú istú tému proste dali naraz články vonku. Čiže vyzerá to skôr ako FAD, hej. Keby to bolo postupné, hej, že by sa začali objavovať problémy, vtedy by som to už bral tak, že OK, všetci sme siví a snažme sa vybrať nejaké peniaze. Ale to bol ten problém toho takého, že ste mohli byť trošička pokojnejší, že naraz prišlo všetko proste bomby naraz na správy. Hej, alebo teda správy prišli na market. Watch Cartoon Network. So much manipulation. No, tak na to by si už mohol zvyknúť. Retail get owned. Pravda. Market down so we can fill the gap. Joj, Čiže áno, vyplnili ten včerajší gap. Trading off of emotions. Pump the dump. No, ľudia tu stavujú na puts. Puts je ináč short, hej. Dobre. Call all day. OK. Let's go. Let's go, let's go. Dar. Sa rozbehni, stojíš na tých istých hodnotách. Printer broken. Ready for turbulence. Tak to asi všetci. Dump and pump. Môže byť. Pokiaľ sa Binance zrúti, tak je krypto KO. Niektoré kryptomeny by v pohode prežili. Hlavne teda Bitcoin si myslím. Hawks flying in. Dobre. Prežili by určite kryptomeny, ale čo sa týka adopcie alebo nejakej vidiny do niekoľkých mesiacov alebo rokov, že by sme mali byť na nejakých šialených číslach, to by bol dosť obrovský problém. Hej, to by bol dosť obrovský problém. OK, ideme na to. A také Juno je v pohode. Klesá rovnako. Ježiš, mám sluchátka s tým noise cancelling a je to také nepríjemné, neviem si na to zvyknúť. Let's crash the market. OK. Ideme na to. No a ešte jednu vec. Nie. Dajte mi vedieť, že či počujete audio. Ešte nič nerozpráva, hej. Chcete, aby som do toho kecal, alebo len to budeme krásne sledovať a budem reagovať na vaše tieto? No, poď, vedúci. Počujete?
Good afternoon. Before I go into the details of today's meeting, I'd like to underscore for the American people that we understand the hardship that high inflation is causing, and that we are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. Over the course of the year, we've taken forceful actions to tighten the stance of monetary policy. We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our rapid tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve.
Dobre, zatiaľ teda povedal, že proste inflácia je stále na vysokých číslach a musia použiť všetko, aby proste položili túto infláciu smerom dole a budú aj naďalej pokračovať v zvyšovaní.
And serves as the bedrock of our economy. Without price stability, the economy doesn't work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC raised our policy interest rate by a half percentage point. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time.
Balance sheet je, hej, to, čo prakticky oni natlačili, tak prakticky vyberajú tie peniaze naspäť z marketu. Čiže toto redukujú, to spôsobuje ten najväčší pád alebo najväčšiu krízu na markete. Nie inflácia, alebo na to navyšovanie 50 bazických bodov, ale práve to.
I'll have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. The U.S. economy has slowed significantly from last year's rapid pace. Although real GDP rose at a pace of 2.9% last quarter, it is roughly unchanged through the first 3 quarters of this year. Recent indicators point to modest growth of spending and production this quarter. Growth in consumer spending has slowed from last year's rapid pace, in part reflecting lower real disposable income and tighter financial conditions. Activity in the housing sector has weakened significantly, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. As shown in our summary of economic projections, the median projection for real GDP growth stands at just 0.5% this year and next, well below the median estimate of the longer-run normal growth rate. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight, with the unemployment rate near a 50-year low, job vacancies still very high, and wage growth elevated. Job growth has been robust, with employment rising by an average of 272,000 jobs per month over the last 3 months. Although job vacancies have moved below their highs and the pace of job gains has slowed from earlier in the year, the labor market continues to be out of balance, with demand substantially exceeding the supply of available workers. The labor force participation rate is little changed since the beginning of the year. FOMC participants expect supply and demand conditions in the labor market to come into better balance over time, easing upward pressures on wages and prices. The median projection in the SEP for the unemployment rate rises to 4.6% at the end of next year.
Inflácia ostáva
Inflation remains well above our longer run goal of 2%. Over the 12 months ending in October, total PCE prices rose 6%. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 5%. In November, the 12-month change in the CPI was 7.1%, and the change in the core CPI was 6%. The inflation data received so far for October and November show a welcome reduction in the monthly pace of price increases. But it will take substantially more evidence to give confidence that inflation is on a sustained downward path. Price pressures remain evident across a broad range of goods and services. Russia's war against Ukraine has boosted prices for energy and food and has contributed to upward pressure on inflation. The median projection in the SEP for total PCE inflation is 5.6% this year and falls to 3.1% next year, 2.5% in 2024, and 2.1% in 2025. Participants continue to see risks to inflation as weighted to the upside. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that is not grounds for complacency. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by a 0.5 percentage point, bringing the target range to 4.25% to 4.5%. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. With today's action, we have raised interest rates by 4.25 percentage points this year. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. Over the course of the year, financial conditions have tightened significantly in response to our policy actions. Financial conditions fluctuate in the short term in response to many factors, but it is important that over time they reflect the policy restraint that we're putting in place to return inflation to 2%. We are seeing the effects on demand in the most interest-sensitive sectors of the economy, such as housing. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, the committee decided to raise interest rates by 50 basis points today, a step down from the 75 basis point pace seen over the previous 4 meetings. Of course, 50 basis points is still a historically large increase, and we still have some ways to go. As shown in the SEP, the median projection for the appropriate level of the federal funds rate is 5.1% at the end of next year, a 0.5 percentage point higher than projected in September. The median projection is 4.1% at the end of 2024 and 3.1% at the end of 2025, still above the median estimate of its longer run value. Of course, these projections do not represent a committee decision or plan, and no one knows with any certainty where the economy will be a year or more from now. Our decisions will depend on the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. And we will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting and communicate our thinking as clearly as possible. We're taking forceful steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a sustained period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the long run. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I will look forward to your questions.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Thanks for taking my question, Mr. Chairman. You just talked about the importance of market conditions reflecting the policy restraint you put in place. Since the November meeting, the 10-year has declined by 60 basis points. Mortgage rates have come down. High-yield credit spreads have come in. The economy's accelerated, and the stock market's up 6%. Is this loosening of financial conditions a problem for the Fed in its effort and its fight against inflation? And if so, do you need to do something about that, and how would you do something about that? Thank you.
So as I mentioned, it is important that overall financial conditions continue to reflect the policy restraint that we're putting in place to bring inflation down to 2%. We think that financial conditions have tightened significantly in the past year, but our policy actions work through financial conditions, and those in turn affect economic activity, the labor market, and inflation. So what we control is our policy moves and the communications that we make. Financial conditions both anticipate and react to our actions. I would add that our focus is not on short-term moves, but on persistent moves. And many things, of course, move financial conditions over time. I would say it's our judgment today that we're not at a sufficiently restrictive policy stance yet, which is why we say that we would expect that ongoing hikes would be appropriate. And I would point you to the SEP, again, for our current assessment of what that peak level will be. As you will have seen, 19 people filled out the SEP this time, and 17 of those 19 wrote down a peak rate of 5% or more, in the fives. So that's our best assessment today for what we think the peak rate will be. You will also know that at each subsequent SEP during the course of this year, we've actually increased our estimate of what that peak rate will be. And today, the SEP that we're published shows that, again, that overwhelmingly FOMC participants believe that inflation risks are to the upside. So I can't tell you confidently that we won't move up our estimate of the peak rate again at the next SEP. I don't know what we'll do. It will depend on future data. What we're writing down today is our best estimate of what we think that peak rate will be based on what we know. Obviously, if inflation data come in worse, that could move up, and it could move down if inflation data are
rozpráva o tom, že sú to len naše očakávania, ale môže to ísť oveľa vyššie. Inflácia. Alebo nižšia, tam už kopnú.
Thanks for taking our questions. The SEP, like you mentioned, suggests that the Fed will be making another 3/4 percentage points worth of rate increases in 2023. I wonder if you would foresee that being in 25 basis point increments, 50 basis point increments, sort of how you see the speed playing out going forward. And then I wonder what you're looking at as you determine when to stop.
Yeah. As I've been saying, as we've gone through the course of this year, as we lifted off and got into the course of the year, and we saw how strong inflation was and how persistent, it was very important to move quickly. In fact, the speed, the pace with which we were moving was the most important thing. I think now that we're coming to the end of this year, we've raised 425 basis points this year, and we're into restrictive territory. It's now not so important how fast we go. It's far more important to think, what is the ultimate level? And then at a certain point, the question will become, how long do we remain restrictive? That will become the most important question. But I would say the most important question now is no longer the speed. So, and that applies to February as well. So I think we'll make the February decision based on the incoming data and where we see financial conditions, where we see the economy, and that'll be the key thing. But I mean, for that decision. But ultimately, that question about how high to raise rates is going to be one that we make looking at our progress on inflation, looking at where financial conditions are, and making an assessment of whether policy is restrictive enough. I've told you today we have an assessment that we're not at a restrictive enough stance, even with today's move, and we've laid out our individual assessments of what we would need to do to get there. At a certain point, though, we'll get to that point, and then the question will be how long do we stay there? And the strong view on the committee is that we'll need to stay there, until we're really confident that inflation's coming down in a sustained way, and we think that will be some time. Now, why do I say that? If you look at you can break inflation down into three sort of buckets. The first is goods inflation, and we see now, as we've been expecting really for a year and a half, that supply conditions would get better.
Ale Ivan, neber to
supply chains
v
get
zlom,
fixed,
hej.
and demand settles down a little
Ja
bit,
len
and maybe
s tým
goes back to
súhlasím, že
services a
proste
little bit,
keď
and we start to see goods
už všetci
inflation coming
kričia,
down.
že je
We're
dno,
now starting to see that,
tak asi ešte
in
dno
this
nemáme.
report and the last one. Then you go to housing services. We know the story there is that housing services inflation has been very, very high and will continue to go up, actually, as rents expire and have to be renewed. They're going to be renewed into a market where rates are higher than they were when the original leases were signed. But we see that the new leases that the rate for new leases is coming down. So once we work our way through that backlog, that inflation will come down sometime next year. The third piece, which is something like 55% of the index, PCE core inflation index, is non-housing related core services. And that's really a function of the labor market largely. The biggest cost by far in that sector is labor. And we do see a very, very strong labor market, one where we haven't seen much softening, where job growth is very high, where wages are very high, vacancies are quite elevated, and really there's an imbalance in the labor market between supply and demand. So that part of it, which is the biggest part, is likely to take a substantial period to get down. The goods inflation has turned pretty quickly now, after not turning at all for a year and a half. Now it seems to be turning, but there's an expectation really that the services inflation will not move down so quickly, so that we'll have to stay at it, so that we may have to raise rates higher to get to where we want to go. And that's really why we are writing down those high rates and why we're expecting that they'll have to remain high for a time.
Áno, je hanba, že sme ani 200 lajkov nedali. Bill Gates.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thanks for taking the question. You described GDP growth in the SEPs as moderate or modest, I believe.
Chcete počúvať aj komenty?
It's really approaching stall speed. 0.5 percentage point is not much. You described labor market unemployment rate as representing some softening, but it's nearly a full percentage point rise, and that's well in excess of what has historically been associated with recession. Why wouldn't this be considered a recessionary projection by the Fed?
Well, I'll tell you what the projection is. I don't think it would qualify as a recession, no, because you've got positive growth. The expectations in the SEP are basically, as you said, which is we've got growth at a modest level, which is to say about 0.5 percentage point. That's positive growth. It's slow growth. It's well below trend. It's not going to feel like a boom. It's going to feel like very slow growth, right? In that condition, labor market conditions are softening a bit. Unemployment does go up a bit. I would say that many analysts believe that the natural rate of unemployment is actually elevated at this moment. So it's not clear that those forecasts of inflation are really much above the natural rate of unemployment. We can never identify its location with great precision. But that 4.7% is still a strong labor market. If you look, you've got the reports we get from the field are that companies are very reluctant to lay people off, other than the tech companies, which is a story unto itself. Generally, companies want to hold on to the workers they have because it's been very, very hard to hire. So, and you've got all these vacancies out there far in excess of the number of employed people. That doesn't sound like a labor market where a lot of people will need to be put out of work. So that there are channels through which the labor market can come back into balance with relatively modest increases in unemployment, we believe. None of that is guaranteed, but that is what their forecast reflects.
Nick.
Dobre sa vyhol tej recesii otázke. Dobre to zahral do auta.
The decision to step down the pace of rate rises appears to have been socialized at your last meeting, largely before the past two CPI reports showed inflation decelerating in line with the committee's forecast this year. You just now talked about making decisions meeting by meeting and being mindful of the lags of policy. Does that mean, all things equal, you would feel more comfortable probing where the terminal rate is by moving in 25 basis point increments, including beginning at your next meeting?
So I haven't made a judgment on what size rate hike to make at the last meeting. But what you said is broadly right, which is having moved so quickly and having now so much restraint that's still in the pipeline, we think that the appropriate thing to do now is to move to a slower pace. And that will allow us to feel our way and and get to that level, we think, and better balance the risks that we face. So that's the idea. It makes a lot of sense, it seems to me, particularly if you consider how far we've come. But again, I can't tell you today what the actual size of that will be. It will depend on.
Čiže on teraz povedal prakticky, že na ďalší rok, že či očakávajú to, že by mohli položiť tie úrokové sadzby na 0,25 boda, alebo teda percenta, 25 bazických bodov. Povedal, že vyzerá podľa neho je to najlepšia cesta, ale uvidíme, aké dáta prídu. Či rozmýšľajú na 25 bazických bodov.
Just a matter of practice, the SEP reflects any data that comes out during the meeting, and participants know that they know this, that they can make changes to their SEP during the meeting, well in advance of the press conference, so that we're not running around. But that's not the case. It's never the case that the SEPs don't reflect an important piece of data that came in on the first day of the meeting.
Thanks. Rachel? Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thank you for taking our questions. I'm wondering if we could talk about the projection for the unemployment rate. Why has the Fed raised its unemployment projection? Is it because the models suggest that a higher terminal rate would automatically cause a higher unemployment rate? Or are you seeing signs that the labor market isn't quite as strong as we think it is now? Thanks.
No, it's not about the strength of the labor market. The labor market is clearly very strong. It is more just that, by now, we've continually expected to make faster progress on inflation than we have ultimately, and that's why the peak rate for this year goes up between this meeting and the September meeting. You see the fact that we've made less progress than expected on inflation, so that's why that goes up, and that's why unemployment goes up, because we're having to tighten policy more. And so it didn't go up by much in the meeting, I don't think, but that's the idea, is slower progress on inflation, tighter policy, probably higher rates, probably held for longer, just to get to where the kind of restriction that you need to get inflation down to 2%.
Olinka, zdravím ťa.
Do you have a sense of, in order to get to that number, how much of that could be caused by layoffs versus vacancies trimming or changes to the labor force population rate?
So it's very hard to say. You can look at history, right? And history would say that in a situation like this, the declines in unemployment would be more meaningful, I think, than what you see written down there. But why do we think that is the case? So I'll give you a few reasons. First, just is that there's this huge overhang of vacancies, meaning that vacancies can come down a fair amount, and we're hearing from many companies that they don't want to lay people off, so that they'll keep people because it's been so hard. I mean, I think it feels like we have a structural labor shortage out there, where there are 4 million fewer people, a little more than 4 million, who are in the workforce available to work than there's demand for workforce. So the fact that there's a strong labor market, means that companies will hold on to workers, and it means that it may take longer, but it also means that the costs in unemployment may be less. Again, that we're going to find out empirically, but I think that's a reasonably possible outcome, and you do hear many labor economists believe that it is. So we'll see, though.
Colby.
Thank you. Colby Smith with the Financial Times. How should we interpret the higher core inflation forecast for 2023 in the SEP? Does that not then suggest that the policy rate currently forecasted for next year should actually be higher than the 5.1 medium estimate penciled in?
Well, I think that's why one of the reasons it went up was that core came in stronger this year. Yeah, what you see is our best estimate as of today, really, as of today, for how high we need to raise rates, to how much we need to tighten policy to create enough, restrictive policy to slow economic activity and soften the labor market and bring inflation down through those channels. That's all you. That is the estimate, best estimate we make today, and as I mentioned, we'll make another estimate for the next SEP, and we'll, of course, between meetings we do the same thing.
Ona sa opýtala, že či môže byť tie očakávanie 5,1% vyššie na ďalší rok. A povedal...
Hi, Victoria Guida with Politico. I wanted to make sure I understand specifically what's going on in the SEP, because you all expect rates to go higher, but you're also more pessimistic about what inflation is going to look like next year. And I was just wondering, given that we have seen some cooling in inflation, is that primarily because of wage growth, that you expect wage growth to be sort of a headwind?
No, we're going into next year with higher inflation than we had thought, right? So we're actually moving down to the level that we're moving down to next year is still a very large drop in inflation from where inflation is running now, well more than a 1% change in inflation. But remember that the jump-off point at the beginning of the year is higher. So we're moving down still by a very large chunk. I don't think the policy's having any less effect. It's just starting from a higher level at the end of 2022. So we're getting down. I believe the median is 3.5%. That's a pretty significant drop in inflation. And where's it coming from? It's coming from the goods sector clearly. By the middle of next year, we should begin to see lower inflation from the housing services sector. And then, the big question is how much will you see from the largest, the 55% of the index, which is the non-housing services sector. And, that's where you need to see, we believe you need to see a better balancing of supply and demand in the labor market, so that you have, it's not that we don't want wage increases, we want strong wage increases, we just want them to be at a level that's consistent with 2% inflation. Right now, if you factor in productivity estimates, standard productivity estimates, wages are running, well above what would be consistent with 2% inflation.
Neil. Thanks. Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. Some of your colleagues have been pretty explicit that they can't imagine rate cuts happening in 2023. That's certainly not implied by the SEP. But futures markets have priced in some easing in the back half of next year. What's your view of the likelihood of any kind of rate cuts next year? What circumstances might make that plausible?
Our focus right now is really on moving our policy stance to one that is restrictive enough to assure a return of inflation to our 2% goal over time. It's not on rate cuts. And we think that we'll have to maintain a restrictive stance of policy for some time. Historical experience cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. I guess I would say it this way. I wouldn't see us considering rate cuts until the committee is confident that inflation is moving down 2% in a sustained way. So that's the test I would articulate. And you're correct, there are not rate cuts
čiže budú navyšovať alebo budú na nulu.
In the SEP for 2023.
Steve Matthews with Bloomberg. Let me ask you about China. In the last few weeks, China has abandoned its COVID policy and been reopening pretty strongly. I'm wondering if you see that as disinflationary because you're seeing supply chains improve, or inflationary because it obviously brings a lot more demand globally, improves the global outlook for growth and for commodities prices.
And so you're right. Those two things will offset each other. Weaker output in China will push down on commodity prices, but it could interfere with supply chains ultimately, and that could push inflation up in the West. It's very hard to say, how those two will offset each other, and it doesn't seem likely actually that the overall net effect would be material on us. But to your point, China faces a very challenging situation in reopening. And we've seen waves of COVID all around the world can interfere with economic activity. China, a very critical manufacturing place for manufacturing and exporting. Their supply chain is very important. China faces a reopening. They've backed away from their COVID restriction policies. There could be very significant increases in COVID, and we'll just have to see. It's a risky situation, but again, it doesn't seem like it's likely to have material overall effects on us.
Comment.
Hi, Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. Thank you for taking my question. I wondered if you could comment a bit more about yesterday's inflation report. I mean, it showed inflation cooling in all three of the categories that you laid out at Brookings. Are you confident that you're seeing real progress on getting inflation under control? Are you still worried it could slip into some kind of unentrenched, upward spiral? Thank you.
Right. So the data that we've received so far for October and November, we don't have we have some remaining data to get in November, but they clearly do show a welcome reduction in the monthly pace of price increases. As I mentioned in my opening statement, it will take substantially more evidence to give confidence that inflation is on a sustained downward path. So the way we think about this report is very much in line with what we've been expecting and hoping for. And what it does is it provides greater confidence in our forecast of declining inflation. As I mentioned, we've been forecasting significant declines in overall inflation and core inflation in the coming year, and this is the kind of reading that it will take to support that. So really this gives us greater confidence in our forecast rather than at this point changing our forecast. In terms of the pieces, we have been expecting goods inflation to come down as supply chain pressures eased. That's happening now. Housing services, as I mentioned, there is good news in the pipeline. As long as new housing leases show declining inflation, that will show up in the measure around the middle of next year, so that should help. And the big piece, again, is core services ex housing, which is very important, and we have a ways to go there. You do see some beginning signs there. Ultimately, that's that more than half, as I mentioned, of PCE core index, and it's very fundamentally about the labor market and wages. If you look at wages, look at the average hourly earnings number we got with the last payrolls report. You don't really see much progress in terms of our average hourly earnings coming down. Now there may be composition effects and other effects in that, so we don't put too much weight on any one report. These things can be volatile month to month, but we'll be looking for wages moving down to more normal levels where workers are doing well and ultimately their gains are not being eaten up by inflation.
Excuse me, Michael McKee from Bloomberg Radio and Television. There's a little bit of a disconnect between the optimistic view you just expressed about the economy and the changes that you've made in the SEP. And I'm wondering if you're reacting to the fact that the markets have loosened financial conditions, or if you feel the Fed may be a little bit behind on inflation, whether the recent disinflation we're seeing is transitory or not, and how this affects the idea of a soft landing if you're projecting just 0.5% growth for this year.
So, if I think I got your question. So, one thing is to say is I think our policies in getting into a pretty good place now. We're restrictive, and I think we're getting close to that level of sufficient, we think, sufficiently restrictive. We laid out today what our best estimates are to get there. I mean, it boils down to how long do we think this process is going to take? And of course, we welcome these better inflation reports for the last 2 months. They're very welcome, but I think we're realistic about the broader project. So that's all. That's the point I would make. It's, we see goods prices coming down. We understand what will happen with housing services, but the big story will really be the rest of it, and there's not much progress there, and that's going to take some time. I think my view and my colleagues' view is that this will take some time. We'll have to hold policy at a restrictive level for a sustained period, so that two good monthly reports are very welcome. Of course, they're very welcome, but I think we need to be honest with ourselves that there's inflation 12-month core inflation
Už
is
dostáva len
6%
trápne otázky,
CPI.
fakt.
That's 3 times our 2% target. Now, it's
Takže
good
majú
to
ešte
see
dosť
progress, but let's
ďaleko.
just understand we have a long ways to go to get back to price stability.
Well, do you think the soft landing is no longer achievable?
No, I wouldn't say that. No, I don't say that. I mean, I would say this, you know, to the extent we need to keep rates higher and keep them there for longer and inflation, you know, moves up higher and higher, I think that narrows the runway. But lower inflation readings, if they persist in time, could certainly
Už
make
keď
it
vy
more
neviete,
possible.
tak
So
to má
I
vedieť.
don't think anyone knows whether we're going to have a recession or not. And if we do, whether it's going to be a deep one or not. It's just, it's not knowable. And certainly, you know, lower inflation reports, were they to continue for a period of time, would increase the likelihood of a, so I would put it this way, of a return to price stability that involves
Už radšej nehovor, lebo pošleš ten market do úplných chytek.
less of an increase in unemployment than would be expected given the historical record.
Ryan. Hi, Chairman Powell. Brian Chung, NBC News. You warned Americans of pain earlier this year as the Fed hikes rates, but with the Fed now expected to raise rates higher than you thought when you first said that, just wondering where we are in that pain. How would you describe that to Americans if the projections on unemployment find themselves? That would be 1.6 million Americans out of jobs.
So the largest amount of pain, the worst pain, would come from a failure to raise rates high enough and from us allowing inflation to become entrenched in the economy so that the ultimate cost of getting it out of the economy would be very high in terms of employment, meaning very high unemployment for extended periods of time, the kind of thing that had to happen when inflation really got out of control and the Fed didn't respond aggressively enough or soon enough in a prior episode, you know, 50 years ago. So that's really the worst pain would be if we failed to act. What we're doing now is, you know, it's raising interest rates for people, and so people are paying higher rates on mortgages and that kind of thing. There will be some softening in labor market conditions, and I wish there were a completely painless way to restore price stability. There isn't, and this is the best we can do. I do think, though, that and markets are pretty confident, it seems to me, that we will get inflation under control, and I believe we will. We're certainly highly committed to do that.
Grady.
Thank
you, Mr. Chair. Grady Trimble with Fox Business. You've reiterated today, and the committee has reiterated its commitment to that 2% inflation target. I wonder, is there ever a point where you actually reevaluate that target and maybe increase your inflation target if it is stickier than even you think it is?
That's just so changing our inflation goal is just something we're not thinking about. It's not something we're not going to think about. We have a 2% inflation goal, and we'll use our tools to get inflation back to 2%. I think this isn't the time to be thinking about that. I mean, there may be a longer run project at some point, but that is not where we are at all. The committee, we're not considering that. We're not going to consider that. Under any circumstances, we're going to keep our inflation target at 2%. We're going to use our tools to get inflation back to 2%.
Sú na 7,1.
Nicole. Thank you, Chairman Powell. Nicole Goodkind, CNN Business. As you monitor wage growth and unemployment data, I wonder if you're paying close attention to a sector or even income level. Like, how do you factor potential exacerbations of inequality into your risk calculations, especially given the K-shaped recovery of 2020?
So I would go back to the labor market that we had in 2018, 19, 20. So what that looked like was wage increases for the people at the lowest end of the income spectrum were the largest. The gaps between racial groups and gender groups were at their smallest in recorded history. All of that because of a tight labor market. A tight labor market which had inflation running, you know, just a tick below 2%, and the economy growing right at its potential. So that seems like something that would be really good for the economy and for the country if we could get back to that. And so that's what all of us want to do. We want to get back to a long expansion where the labor market can remain strong over an extended period of time, that's a really good thing for workers in the economy, and we'd love to get back to that. That's what our goal is. You know, there's in the near term, we have to use our tools to restore price stability, but we can't. What we have to think about is the medium and longer term. If you think about it, the country went through a difficult time. I think much more difficult than we can think it would happen here, but it really set up our economy for several decades of prosperity. So price stability is something that really pays dividends for the benefit of the economy and the people in it over a very, very long period of time. And so when it is lost, for whatever reason, it has to be restored, and as quickly as possible, which is what we're doing.
In the short term, are you factoring in these potential exacerbations in the economy? Are you monitoring?
We do, yes, we absolutely do. We look at, it's our regular practice to talk about unemployment rates by different groups, including racial groups and that sort of thing. We do. We keep our eye on that.
Satoshi. Dobrý koment.
Hi, Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. What would you do if the economy slows so much that we enter a recession before we see strong, consistent signs that inflation is slowing? In other words, stagflation.
So I don't want to get into too many hypotheticals, but you know, it's hard to deal with hypotheticals. So let me just say that we have to use our tools to support maximum employment and price stability. I've made it clear that right now the labor market's very, very strong. You're at near a 50-year low. You're at or above maximum employment, in 50-year low in unemployment. Vacancies are very high, nominal wages are very high. So the labor market is very, very strong. Where we're missing is on the inflation side, and we're missing by a lot on the inflation side. So that means we need to really focus on getting inflation under control, and that's what we'll do. I think as the economy heals, the two goals come more into play. But right now, clearly the focus has to be on getting inflation down.
Thank you, Chairman Powell. Greg Robb from MarketWatch. You spoke a little bit ago. You said that the U.S. it looks like we have a structural labor shortage in the economy. Could you expand on that? Talk a little bit more about that. And really, are you talking about getting Congress action on increasing like legal immigration, things like that? Thank you.
So what I meant by that with structural labor shortage is if you look at where we are now, as I mentioned. If you just look at demand for labor, you can look at vacancies plus people who are actually working, and then you can take supply of labor by are you in the labor market, are you looking for a job or have a job, and you're more than 4 million people short. We don't see, despite very high wages and an incredibly tight labor market, we don't see participation moving up, which is contrary to what we thought. So the upshot of all that is the labor market is actually. It's 3.5 million people at least smaller than it should have been based on pre-pandemic, just assume population and reasonable growth and aging of the population. Our labor force should be 3.5 million more than it is. And that there are lots of easy ways to get to bigger numbers than that if you go back a few more years. So why is that? Part of it is just accelerated retirements. People dropped out and aren't coming back at a higher rate than expected. Part of it is that we lost 500,000 people who would have been close to 500,000 who would have been working, who died from COVID. And part of.
Dobre, prečo ten market teraz stúpa, je to, že my sme dostali dobré výsledky aj ohľadom CPI-ka, aj od tohto daného pána, hej, keďže je tu predsa len to navyšovanie o očakávaných 50 bazických bodov. Čiže my tú pozitivitu tu stále máme. To, čo on povedal, hej, že to bude navyšovanie aj naďalej pre rok 2023, market to začne začleňovať. Zatiaľ teda nemôžeme rozprávať o žiadnom odpálení marketu, ale ten market sa teraz spamätáva z toho, že už dostal tie najzákernejšie alebo najzásadnejšie otázky a vyzerá to tak, že troška sa ukľudnil ten daný market a preto už začína ten market trošičku pozitivitu skrz toho, že proste si myslí, že už to teraz neposerie. nejakú otázku.
Or how deep of a recession you would be willing to accept?
No, I mean, what we do is we make our forecasts and we publish them quarterly. And you know, if you look at those forecasts, those are forecasts for slow growth, for a softening labor market, by which I mean unemployment goes up, but not a great deal. And you see inflation coming down. You see rates going up a lot. You see inflation coming down. Those are those forecasts, and that's really what they show. We're not. We all, of course, we don't talk about you know, this kind of a recession and that kind of a recession. We make those forecasts. The staff runs, and you will see this if you look at the old Teal books, runs alternative simulations of all different kinds at every meeting, and we look at those too. And those will explore different things, but that's just you know, upside and downside scenarios. Of course, that's responsible practice that we carry on for many decades. But no, we don't. We haven't asked ourselves that question.
We'll go to Jean for the last question.
Hi, Jean Young with Market News. I wanted to ask about the SEP again. If you are reaching peak rates around 5% in the first half of next year, and inflation starts to decline materially, that would seem to make the real rate gradually more restrictive. Is that something that's built into the projections and into models? Is that something you would want to see?
So we do know that, of course. That's something that we know and we'd see. But as I mentioned, you know, I wouldn't see the committee cutting rates until we're confident that inflation is moving down in a sustained way. That would be my test. I don't see us as having a really clear and precise understanding of what the neutral rate is and what real rates are, so that it would mechanically happen like that. It'll be a test of, for cutting rates, I think in the event it'll be a question of, do we actually feel confident that inflation is coming down in a sustained way? Thank you very much.
Takže, zistili sme veľký kulový. Market spravil veľký kulový. Čiže nie. Dobře. Takže. OK, toto môžem vypnúť. Sekundičku, dajte mi ešte, jak to tu povypínam. No. OK. Takže. Toto môžem celé vypnúť. Jasné. No. Takže. Nič sme sa nedozvedeli, nič sa tu poriadne ani nestalo. Spravíme si analýzku Bitcoinu. Takže. No. Ideme teda na to. Bitcoin teda spravil... Ježiš, normálne ma rozkopu ľudia. Čiže dobre, hitli sme tú vrchnú hodnotu rezistencie, sme ňou zatiaľ teda odmietaní a dosť brutálne. Na 12 hodinovke akože zatiaľ nejaký ten stres a paniku nevidno, ale už na tých menších timeframoch vidno, že práve Jerome Powell nepotešil príliš veľmi market. Skrz toho, že oznámil proste, že aj tak bude navyšovanie úrokových sadzieb aj na ďalší rok, že zatiaľ sa objavujú nejaké tie trhlinky v labor markete, alebo teda na trhu práce a hlavne teda aj na nehnuteľnostiach, ale že zatiaľ je všetko úplne v poriadku, že zažívame rastový hormón stále. Čiže nepotešil príliš veľmi market, mám taký pocit, že hlavne tou projekciou. Nič katastrofálne sa nestalo, čo sa správ týka, práve naopak, hej, tie správy sú predsa len stále ešte pozitívne. Čo sa týka marketu, mám taký pocit, že by sme tomu mali nechať ešte nejakú tú chvíľku. 45 minútovka by mohla byť ten timeframe, ktorý by nás mal trošička podržať. Prepadli sme cez 21, zatiaľ držíme tú 30. To odmietnutie je veľmi škaredé, čiže market je predsa len naladený dosť negatívne, alebo teda minimálne po skončení tejto rozpravy stále market sa neudržiava na nejakej pozitívnej hodnote. hodnote. Takisto aj S&P 500 market a takisto aj Bitcoin. Je veľmi teraz dôležité, aby... nie 15 minútovka, ale 45 minútovka. Tu je Bitcoin, aha. Čiže čo potrebujeme je, aby S&P 500 market sa ťahal smerom hore. Lebo to je jediný hráč, ktorý proste dosť brutálne ovplyvňuje Bitcoin. Hej, proste či sa nám to páči, alebo sa nám to nepáči. Zatiaľ teda najväčším podporovateľom práve Bitcoinu je, alebo teda tým, čo ho zhadzuje, je práve S&P 500 market, ktorý nezareagoval príliš veľmi najlepšie, keďže otvára fakt, že vyklesaním. Čo sa týka daily grafu a takisto aj na Bitcoine, tu na to stále ináč ostáva ten istý level pre S&P 500 market a takisto aj pre Bitcoin, čiže pre Bitcoin je to stále ešte v úplnom poriadku a netreba očakávať žiadne 12 000, ako sa písalo na začiatku, že dovidenia a čau a papa, lebo tu nás sme mali veľmi pekný progres smerom hore, stále bude supportová hodnota na hodnote $17 782, následne ďalšia hodnota $17 200 necelých a potom ešte stále 30. Pokiaľ nie sme pod tou danou hodnotou 30, ani nerozmýšľam nad 12 000, hej, ako náhle začneme lámať tieto dané levely, vtedy môžeme o niečom takom rozmýšľať. Čo je negatívne, je práve to vyklesanie S&P 500 marketu, ktorý vyklesáva fakt, že dosť škaredo, dosť nepekne. Ten zatiaľ takisto nie je v nejakých brutálnych problémoch. Pokiaľ si drží pokiaľ weekly ostane nad hodnotou 21, 30, je to veľmi pozitívne. Ak prepadne cez hodnotu do konca tohto týždňa, hej, čiže mu ešte ostáva štvrtok a piatok, v piatok sa bude zatvárať ten daný market 3900 bodov až 3886 bodov, tak by to malo byť stále veľmi pozitívne. A ako náhle prepadne cez tieto dané línie, je to zlé, hej. Správy prišli. Nebolo tam nič také zlé, hej. Alebo také prekvapivé, hej. Neboli tam žiadne prekvapenia, čiže vidno, že proste Wall Street zatiaľ nie je ešte naladené nejako príliš veľmi bullish. Čiže... Ale zatiaľ teda, hej. Čo sa týka Bitcoinu, tu je to veľmi jednoduchá story. Viem, že proste viacerí sú tdmún, ale ešte netreba byť, hej. Minimálne pokiaľ fakt, že na tých väčších timeframoch a hlavne, hej, toto je jediný bod, ktorý by vás mal zaujímať na weekly. To bolo presne to isté po prepade 21, ešte tu bola jedna záchranná línia, ako náhle sme začali zatvárať po touto danou líniou šluz a koniec. A to isté bude aj taká tá prvá predpoveď niečoho zaujímavého alebo nejakého otáčania po prekonaní 21 a 30, hej. To isté bolo pri prepade 21 a 30. Čiže weekly si všímať z toho dlhodobého hľadisku. Zatiaľ proste Bitcoin, hej, ide si testovať 200, no. Čiže veľa by som od toho neočakával. Menšie timeframey nám takisto nenaznačujú. Akože zatiaľ teda na 15 minútovke sa drží chlapec. Longy by som neskúšal, pokiaľ nie sme nad hodnotou 50, čiže to je $17 935, aj to zatváranie. Short zatiaľ tam určite nie je na mieste, hej. Aspoň teda zatiaľ. Čiže asi skôr po tou 15 minútovkou, tam by som sa na to pozrel, ale to je zase na menších timeframoch. Škaredé odmietnutie na 5 minútovke. Wow, veľmi škaredé. No predsa len tu bude nejaká príležitosť. Ktorý coin to bude? No, dobře, čiže dneska bude predsa len... hej, teraz je najhoršie na tom to, že treba si zase odsledovať, vybrať coiny. Kde si? Čiže ty si zatiaľ v pohodičke úplnej. Ešte si nehýtol. Čiže dobre, hej, dneska akože veľmi pekné naladenie marketu, hej. No nič, kamarát nebude šťastný. No dobře, ak nie ste teda v šortovej pozícii, hlavne na takýchto coinoch, netrepte sa tam zbytočne, hej. Lebo fakt, že je to ešte príliš čerstvé teraz. ten market bude rozlietaný aj naďalej, alebo môže byť aj naďalej rozlietaný. 45 minútovka nevyzerá dobre. Hej. Minimálne nevyzerá dobre, čo sa týka price akcie. 21, 30, to je level, ktorý sme pozreli zase. Čo sa týka nejakej katastrofy, ani náhodou, hej, proste brzdná línia stále ostáva tá istá. 17 370 $, až tá hodnota 17 288 $. Čiže zatiaľ, čo sa týka 45 minútovky, vyzerá to korekcia, hej, väčšia korekcia nastáva. Brutálne odmietnutie od tej rezistencie, na ktorú som upozorňoval, hej, to je ten taký základný level. Čiže veľmi silná rezistencia je 18 100 $, až tá vrchná hodnota 18 800 $. Čiže táto zóna, alebo táto hodnota, síce je tlstá ako prase, ale proste je to rezistencia a aj ostáva rezistenciou. Dobre, dámy a páni, zajtra je lepšie večera, či ako sa to hovorí. Takže ideme do Hajan, sme tu už nejakú tú chvíľku, pozrieme sa na to, že ako sa nám darí, čo sa týka lajkov. Čiže zatiaľ teda sme neodpálili dekel na lajkoch, 260 lajkov, 380 ľudí sleduje tento daný kanál. Ďakujem veľmi pekne všetkým, ktorí ste prišli na tento daný kanál a budeme pomaličky končiť. Uvidíme. Zajtra Patreoni možno by mohol byť live stream. Uvidím, že ako Klaudia na tom bude, keďže majú večierok. Čiže zajtra uvidíme. Celkovo v nedeľu je zase futbal, to už by som si aj pozrel. No uvidíme, ale tento týždeň si spravíme určite nejakú tú analýzu. Zajtra múdrejšia večera. Či ráno je múdrejšia večera, presne. Dobre, čiže ďakujem veľmi pekne, že ste, ja verím, jen když, čomu veríš? Že Bitcoin pôjde po 10 000? Keď Binance padne, tak to môžeme zabudnúť na 10 000, mám taký pocit. No, dobře, uvidíme, ale spravím nejaké updaty. Ako som hovoril, teraz trošičku tomu treba nechať, hej, marketu chvíličku, proste nech sa ukľudní chlapec. Zatiaľ fakt, že máme signifikantný dump, ale mali sme aj veľmi signifikantný rast. Hej, čiže zatiaľ no stress, no panika. Pokiaľ nie sme pod kritickými hodnotami tejto línie, hej, 17 350 až 16 800 netreba zatiaľ nejako príliš veľmi panikáriť, ale treba nechať vyklesať ten daný market, nech si príde na nejaké supporty, ak začnú otočky, alebo teda keď Bitcoin proste vyklesá nejakým šialeným tempom a nie ste v žiadnej pozícii, tak proste treba si vyčkať na ďalší pohyb. No, dobře, dámy a páni, ďakujem veľmi pekne, že ste došli na tento kanál. Idem si ja s Leom vonku. Dobre, spravíme ďalšie nejaké updaty. Ja to celkovo aj vystrihám, alebo teda sa budem snažiť vystrihať, alebo teda nejako sa ešte vyjadriť k tým daným dátam a následne aj k grafu, ale necháme tomu minimálne aspoň ukľudnenie. Čo sa týka marketu, ešte sa pozrieme na jednu vec, kedy sa nám zatvára S&P 500 market a uvidíme, že či Bitcoin niečo dokáže spraviť sám. S&P 500 market sa zatvára o 41 minút a 52 0 sekúnd, čiže pokiaľ sa udrží nad touto danou hodnotou, je to celkovo tuto money fig, alebo bude to celkovo v poriadku s tým, že tam môžeme potom si byť viac než istý, že Bitcoin proste zamrzne na nejakých hodnotách, ak S&P 500 tu niečo proste nerozpúta šialené. Čiže tam sa bude dať očakávať, že proste Bitcoin zase bude čakať na S&P 500 market, ale dáta prišli v podstate pozitívnejšie. Dobre, budeme sa o tom baviť neskôr na nejakom live streame, pozrieme si nejaké grafy. Už by som chcel začať robiť aj analýzky postupné na nejaké tie coiny, lebo na strašne veľa lídrov zabúdam, a to konkrétne na Ether, hej, na ten sme už dlho nepozerali, takisto aj na Solaničku, Cardano, One, Eagle, Atom a tak ďalej. Čiže chcel by som sa pozrieť aj na nejaké zaujímavejšie levely na týchto daných coinoch. Dobře, ale zatiaľ pre dnešok je to teda konec, zazvonil zvonec a my ideme pekne do Hajan. Ďakujem vám veľmi pekne, vidíme sa v ďalšom videu a